Welcome to another series of LabTalks. This is an Eidgensi Takeover. Joining me today, we've got Chorley, LabTalks regular. We'll do proper introductions shortly, and also Morgan as well. But why we're here today really is to chat about everything NFTs. Over the past few years, we've seen NFTs kind of blow up. There's been numerous projects and they continue to grow, but with varying success. There's a pretty vast landscape, and we just want to chat about, you know, some of the failures, some of the concepts, some of the teams behind the projects, and much, much more. So yeah, really this is going to kind of lean into why I've got these two people in the room with me. So Chorley, you're a bit of a NFT enthusiast. I
think the word you're looking for is degen.
Degen, thank you. Yeah, sorry, trying to kind of keep it a little bit more open when we have an Eidgensi takeover. But yeah, no, that's you're a degen.
Yeah, why not? I mean, I've lost enough money on NFTs, so I think that means I get those stripes.
Yeah. What's your worst loser then? Sorry to call you out. Now you've mentioned it.
Ooh, I mean, probably my Bored Apes Land. That was quite bad. That was because there was also a horrendous amount of gas fees that went into that in the gas wars that took place. So I think that ended up costing me somewhere in the region of about 6 ETH or something.
I was thinking about that today. Whatever happened with that? Okay.
I mean, it's in my wallet.
Okay.
I mean, that's what's quite interesting as well. And, you know, this kind of part of the podcast is aimed at maybe like more kind of people that are new into NFTs and haven't really, you know, had the degen stripe wearing experiences you've talked about, Chorley. But yeah, gas fees is a pretty big one and often can put people off, or seems like a hidden cost if you don't really understand you know much about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's since the release of ETH2 has somewhat subsided, but we haven't been in a bull market whilst people are actually just trying to do ETH transactions at the same time as a big mint event. So yeah, I mean, that was pretty much peak, I think, for gas fees ever paid from like one mint. So that was about as bad as it got. But because like a lot of people didn't get them and still ended up paying like a couple of ETHs worth of gas fees just to try and get into the actual mint process. So it was kind of crazy, but that's quite a unique example, I think. Yeah,
I mean, and just to roll back on that, for anyone that doesn't understand what gas fees is, can you give a little kind of brief overview of what that is?
Yeah, so essentially it's a fee that is paid to validators in order to prioritize blocks. So some of it is just a fee that you would have to have a minimum charge for. Then there's prioritization that goes into that fee, so you can have like a low to a high fee. You can also decide to overpay in order to get that priority on a block. So that's what a lot of people were doing in that situation, which is why it was horrendous.
Nice. So there's a bit of kind of like a supply war, and I guess like in layman's terms, maybe that would be, you know, you're trying to get a Glastonbury ticket and a lot of like traffic jammed or whatever.
Yeah, that is the Web 1, maybe Web 0 version.
Exactly.
Is the old phone line trying to get a Glastonbury ticket, which I've also been involved in.
God, through the ages. Okay. So moving over to our next guest, Morgan. So Morgan's director of Web3 at Eidgensi. So, you know, Eidgensi Takeover, you're well at home here, but do you want to talk about a little bit about your experience within kind of implementing and delivering NFT projects?
Sure. So when I joined Eidgensi, we started Eidgensi about a year ago. We started off with a few internal projects. So we obviously helped the Alkimi boys with the Alex the Alchemist series. So that was a good introduction to the space for me because typically I was working on e-commerce builds, so I was fairly new to the space. But yeah, over the last year, we have done a couple paid for NFT projects that have gone really well. I guess one in particular is Genico that I can talk about today. So for those of you that aren't aware about who Genico is or what they do, Genico is the world's first cryptographically secured healthcare data exchange. So I'm sure people have heard of Ancestry.com or 23andMe. Essentially, you get a little gizmo where you prick your finger and you give a company your DNA. That probably costs you about $100 to get. Those companies aren't making money off those units they're sending you for $100. What they're doing is they're making money on the data they sell on the back end. So Genico is very much similar. They're sending you a gizmo for you to prick your finger and you get lots of kind of health data information on yourself. But you're actually getting rewarded on that data on the back end. So once you kind of submit your data, they'll sell that on to other companies, and then you will get rewarded in their own native token, which is the Eidgensi Co token. So that's the overall concept of the project. I guess to go into more particulars about how it went down, what they sold, etc. It was an NFT project. They had a Genesis pass. So essentially they sold 900, or they had 920 Genesis NFT passes up for sale, costing, I think it was 0.15 ETH. At the time was around $200 roughly. So the kind of main utility that you get with this NFT is that you will get off the bat 5,000 Eidgensi Co tokens through their app, and you will also get a free DNA test. So when Eidgensi Co came to us, they had two requirements. Requirement one was to raise money. They need to raise some money, and requirement number two is they needed to generate some healthcare data for their app. Those are the two main requirements. So that is why we thought an NFT project would be perfect for this, because they have almost sold out the 920 NFT Genesis passes, which is going to generate the business close to $200,000 in revenue. And now they have close to 1,000 people's data uploaded into their app. So they now have a baseline level of data that they can now work with.
Nice.
Yep.
That's really interesting as well as like a proposition, because I think it's very Web3 to kind of take back ownership of, your data or part of the internet, how you're kind of, served to, and having that kind of proposition where you ultimately opt in to give your data to then be sold, but you're kind of part of that kind of remuneration rather than it just being used at a company. That's a really kind of like nice way to flip it. And I guess then, to tie that in with an NFT, that seemed like a really good solution.
Yep, exactly. People are now aware that their data is going to be taken, might as well get compensated for it, basically.
Yeah, it's that permission versus consent thing that we always talk about, especially, online data is the biggest data leak that happens kind of generally. So it's always quite interesting when people come up with novel ways to secure personal data.
Nice. And I'm conscious we've got a bit of a mixed audience on here. The D-Gens, the Alkimi's finest, we'll all know. But do you want to talk a bit about what a Genesis Pass is and what that means in the NFT world?
Yeah, so Chorley, please jump in here. I'm sure you know more about what naturally comes with the Genesis Pass than I do. But typically it is the first series often that a company will release in terms of an NFT project. And it's can be their flagship one. Sometimes this NFT project is like the foundation, which they will build upon for years to come or quarters to come. And aesthetically, they do typically seem to stay consistent in terms of the artwork. There might be some different variables to it, but it's very much the initial NFT project a company will release. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, and it's kind of gives you a bit of OG status as well, right? I mean, a lot of these NFT projects is generally about status and like having online status. So having an OG pass, like a Genesis pass, means that you were there first, and people kind of have a bit of a respect for that kind of status that you can get from it. But there's been some quite interesting mechanisms where people have not made their major pass the actual Genesis one as well. So just thinking of like potatoes with the captains, and the captains were actually the sort of bigger, better version, and the potatoes went first. So there's quite a lot of different ways that you can roll it out, but like you said, it's if you call it a Genesis pass, it's normally because it's a smaller number, and then you roll on to the next generation of NFT, and those people get into that mint for the second one, so they get added upside because they were in first, and you kind of get that sort of tokenomics vibe going in there as well.
Nice. I think it's quite interesting because, before you couldn't really capture this. If you were first to find out a band, it'd just be a bit hearsay, right? You might share it with someone, but now you can kind of quantify, I was the first person to back this by X, Y, Z, and you've got that kind of, that trail. And I think this is where, Web3 community really comes into its own, and how you can really build like a loyal community and fan base around this kind of, having a badge of honor almost.
Yeah, and I think it's an amazing feature of NFTs in general is the digital scarcity that it creates. I mean, obviously that is very similar to like how cryptos work, but they do have slightly different dynamics, and having that ability to create digital scarcity is something that is obviously, I mean, we were around when people were like stealing music and stuff, but you know, it's like that is an example of the exact opposite. Is like a lack of scarcity on those files that you can just download over peer-to-peer networks. But yeah, the ability to create digital scarcity means that you can also attribute other factors to that digital item, such as status or whatever.
Yeah, or utility, and I think we'll get onto that shortly. But one thing I wanted to dive in before we go on any further. So we've talked quite, specific about, potentially like Web3 focused brands and things like that, and we've seen the value in the community that they get around them. Fierce, loyal, kind of users or community, whichever one you want to call it. But now we're seeing as well Web2 brands break into the space, and as I said at the top of the kind of podcast. There's been some varying success. So, maybe let's start with one that hasn't gone so well in the very recent news. So Porsche have just done their web cups, their NFT release, and it flopped pretty hard, mainly due to the minting price. And then, as you've just mentioned, around the availability or scarcity of the NFTs. Do you have any kind of more thoughts on that, and maybe why it wasn't a success?
Well, it's been quite an interesting 24 hours just from the fact that there was the Porsche fail, and then there's also Yuga Labs, I think, is like doing the sewer passes today, and then Doodles 2 just made an announcement. So it's like quite a broad spectrum of like a big Web2 brand kind of failing at it very badly, and like a couple of brands that have like been born in Web3 and kind of utilize that kind of viral factor to it. But I think it's quite there's other examples as well of like mistakes that have been made by big brands, and then also very successful things that big brands have done. So with the Porsche one, it's again you've got to understand the audience that you're speaking to. Like that is 101 of a business proposition of anything. But I think because they are already a very large business and this is a very small thing for them, they kind of didn't really give it the due care and attention they probably should have done. I think it's also quite interesting that these Web 2 or like kind of beyond Web 2, I mean they're basically Web 0 brands, they spend a lot of time talking about how you can interact with their brands and how their brand is perceived by their audience, and yet they then completely mess it up on stuff like this. So another example I always bring up, because I've actually got one, is the Adidas NFT. So it's very patchy. The delivery's been a bit on and off. Like I think the original passes, somebody minted something like 75% of all the passes in the first mint because they interacted with the smart contract. They didn't know how to do that. They didn't know anything about that. I've heard that it was their marketing team that did it, so they were probably learning on the job at the same time. Okay. They then gave that NFT utility by you burning it, because I think that they hadn't really thought about what they were going to do with it afterwards. So burnt it, got another one, got another couple off the back of it. But Adidas has spent a very long time building a brand presence for itself online, and then to just take a stab at something like that and kind of be a bit careless really, by not working with professional outfit like Eidgensi or whoever else, it kind of opens their brand up for negative rather than getting a positive out of it. And all of this should be a net positive, right? Because you're basically just trying to build an engagement with your brand and a community around it. So if you mess up, you've kind of like wasted a lot of goodwill that you've spent a long time earning. Another good example of like somebody doing very well with it and taking that approach of being more diligent and like partnering with experts is obviously Nike. So Nike, obviously with Artifact, they went and spent a lot of money buying Artifact, but Artifact already had Clone X out, so there was already a kind of level of engagement with that brand, and then rather than kind of scrapping that once they bought it because it wasn't quite relevant to the Nike brand, they just absorbed it and made it part of what they were doing. And then obviously Artifact are very smart guys and girls who know how to create hype around an NFT. So then they did the shoes, and they did like the vials for the shoes, and there's a lot of boxes. They've gamified it, and really that is a very stark difference to Adidas. So it's kind of crazy that like two very big sports brands who basically fight with each other everywhere in every sort of domain, whether it's basketball, football, whatever, trying to get the biggest sponsorship deals for people. And then they just took two very different approaches and had two very, very different outcomes on something like NFTs.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And, you know, just to kind of roll back on some of the maybe not so successful projects, it's that, I think from what I've heard from you, it's the naivety of going into, there's actually a lot more to this than just making a quick buck. You know, I think there's in one of our slides decks that we send out, we show around about the secondary market of NFTs and the sales there. And I think one of the examples is Tiffany didn't think about secondary sales on their NFTs. So they made a few bucks in the kind of first round, but then didn't really capitalize on what is essentially a secondary market, which is super unique for a kind of consumer retail brand that would never be able to kind of monetize something beyond selling the single product. You know, Rolex have a huge problem with that. In the grey market is huge. But yeah, just to, you know, around that naivety more, when you're speaking with clients or, you know, taking people through the kind of NFT process, or how you even will tackle their challenge and bring their kind of NFT dream to life, how do you kind of, you know, help them through that kind of naivety of not understanding it? And are there any kind of safeguards you put in place so you don't have, you know, potentially the Adidas disaster that Chorley spoke about?
Is there any safeguards that I put up? I guess off the bat, I'm just very honest about everything. It is, I don't know quite how to answer this. I guess it's just being super honest about how everything works and being realistic about what's achievable. Because I'm sure with the Porsche example, a big reason why maybe it flopped, and this isn't necessarily true, but this is slightly my perspective, is they probably didn't do a whole bunch of due diligence in what their current Web 2 customers actually wanted or how integrated they were with what they were up to. I mean, I'm sure most people that own a Porsche are pretty... They're the Web 2 consumers. They probably make a bunch of money on average, and they're probably in their 30s or 40s at least. So there probably wasn't too many people that were just already involved in Web 3, even knew how to purchase a Porsche NFT in the first place. And then they are making it around $1,500, whatever that ETH price is. I mean, for what? I think they offered a 3-part journey where your Porsche can change color, like your Porsche NFT. I mean, I think you need to offer a bit more utility than that. Yeah. And I'm sure they might have grand plans down the line, but you kind of have to probably allude to those a bit more, because I mean, you can't just flog something for $1,500 and your NFT changes color these days. So I guess just to relate back to your original question is just to stay honest with your community, what you're going to be delivering them. Don't just hike up the prices because you see other people doing it, and just keeping proper realistic about everything.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I know from I guess the safeguard point of view, it's maybe thinking about, you know, what future utility could hold, so you don't run into the same problem that Adidas did, as Chorley mentioned, where they had to burn it and then re-release it. Maybe, you know, maybe leaning into those more traditional kind of marketing methods of actually understanding what you're trying to deliver, right? So it's maybe saying, okay, well, understanding what's in the market, what the desire is, and what, you know, could be a suggested good utility for them, right? So that probably just takes a bit more market research and understanding rather than just, you know, putting a finger up in the air and hoping for the best. And that's what it kind of felt like out of that project.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you just think about an NFT, seems like quite straightforward and quite simple, but really there's levels to this game.
Yes.
And they need to have more of a holistic strategy to begin with. It's what is the purpose of this? Why are you actually doing it? Are you just doing it to make a quick buck? Or are you doing it because you do want to engage the next generation of users into the Porsche brand and make them, you know, have desirability around the Porsche brands, rather than just rather than flogging them a t-shirt for $30, we can sell them an NFT for $1,500. Aren't we so clever? It's not that difficult to do. You just got to be like you would with any strategy of anything else that they do. You know, there's probably a lot of thought and process goes into that. So it did seem a bit sloppy just to sort of make it expensive and not really offer any utility. I mean,
Exactly. And like you mentioned as well, I think a lot of reasons why brands would get into the NFT space, depending on where their demographic sits, there is obviously that huge demographic of degens or aspiring, degens or people that want to get into the Web3 space. And they want to kind of capitalize on them to either get them as early customers or new customers, whatever it may be along their journey. And there could be something much more valuable about engaging someone that maybe could afford $1,500 and then have them as a very engaged user whilst providing, I don't know if it's track days or, whatever it is, but just something that feels a bit more kind of tangible than just,
Yeah. And as part of that holistic view, right, it's like there's a lot that can go into it. Like you can engage your users by having them like turn up at events and like look super pumped, but you get content off the back of it, things like that. It's like kind of that is the further out view rather than just like, oh yeah, well, we can make some money for basically nothing here. It's like, yeah, but if you then flip that into a powerful marketing tool, it's like something that has not been available to brands before, to actually like keep them engaged. Really, it's that kind of building communities, not audiences argument.
Absolutely. And the Web2 is definitely not dead, but as we kind of move into this Web3 era, we're going to see people be less engaged in the more traditional Web2 ways. It's a bit of a kind of cascading effect at the moment, and this is kind of the forefront of personally how I see that we're going to communicate with consumers going forward. So this is all fantastic learning at the moment, and I guess I kind of jumped you with that question earlier, Morgs, but maybe that's it, right? Just understanding before why what the utility might be down the line, understanding from other failures, how people got attacked and then putting safeguards around there. So I know we've had several conversations about how we've even before what's the right smart contract to go for, because there's different kind of abilities with each of them. Do you want to maybe talk about a little bit about kind of different smart contracts you've used and maybe the pros and cons of each?
Yeah, sure. So I guess there's probably two main ones that we'll use. An ERC 721 and an ERC 1155. So I guess the main difference is an ERC 721 means the token is unique. So if you want them to look different and behave, have different traits, different descriptions, etc., that is the main reason why you'd go for that contract. Whereas an ERC 1155 basically means all tokens are indistinguishable. They're the exact same. So I believe the Alkimi ads token is an ERC 1155 because every single ads token is exactly the same. They're interchangeable. So it really is down to the project, what they are trying to achieve, which one will go down. But what I'm really starting to learn over the last kind of couple years is how important it is to plan ahead with these smart contracts. And that is where somewhere like Eidgensi really can help these brands, because you got to think ahead quite far with what you're trying to achieve. So say for instance, do you only want one person the ability to mint an NFT? That is something you're going to have pre-programmed into the smart contract before you launch the project. And just to make it clear to everyone, once that smart contract is written and deployed, you can set a few traps for yourself to kind of get you out of trouble. But once that's deployed to the blockchain, that's written to the blockchain, and that can't be changed for the most part. So one thing I've definitely learned over the last kind of couple of years is all the nuances and things to look out for with these contracts, such as whitelisting, allow lists. I'm trying to think off the top of my head some of the other traps that I've fallen into.
Yeah, I think there's because it's the kind of on-chain versus off-chain utility piece, right? And I think there's the stuff that happens on chain obviously like carries fees with it, so you've got to be like careful that you need it. And there's a lot of things that probably don't need to be on chain. So if you're using it to log into something, for example, that doesn't really need to be like an on chain action.
Yep.
So it's like those kind of bits, isn't it, where it's like I mean, I'm thinking of, for example, like a Uniswap smart contract is very clever. There's like, does a lot of different things that happen on chain all at once, or, you know, in varying different forms, versus like something like an NFT PFP, which can basically just be on chain, and that's basically all it needs to do.
Yeah, exactly. And just on that NFT PFP part, there's a big trend now moving to Polygon blockchain, but people don't realize that for people to buy an NFT on the Polygon blockchain, they're going to have to have a couple steps beforehand. So they're going to have the native Polygon token in their wallet, which is the Matic or Matic, however you pronounce it. You're going to have implemented the Polygon network to your MetaMask wallet. So it's just things like this that I've learned that we can help brands with and help them avoid these little traps that we've fallen into over the last couple of years. So yeah, and there's lots of them.
Definitely. I mean, that one's quite interesting, is the sort of Polygon versus ETH argument, because it's like, originally it's like, oh yeah, it's cheaper, so let's use Polygon. And then you kind of realize that then you've got to train everybody how to switch their wallet mainnets or whatever. It's like a bit crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is essentially another step in the journey, right? And that's, you know, if we're thinking about mass adoption and getting people there, and I'm sure with evolution of text and more kind of versions being brought out, we're going to see these sorts of things subside. But as it stands at the moment, any kind of extra jump can often be a barrier to, especially a kind of retail investor at this stage.
Definitely.
So, you know, what you guys have been chatting about and what's really interesting is you can kind of see how some of these big brands have got tripped up, you know, regardless of budgets. There is just this vast knowledge base. It is a complex, but obviously highly profitable or potentially profitable kind of area of a business. So yeah, you kind of have a little bit of sympathy with them, but equally when they are worth, you know, billions of pounds, they probably should invest in the right people to get it done.
Yep.
So Chor, I'm going to put you on the spot after this one. What projects are you excited about coming up, you know, or anything in the last kind of, you know, 6 to 12 months that's really excited you in the NFT space?
So I've been waiting for a while, but I'm quite excited about Doodles too. I don't actually own a Doodle, I have to admit, but because I'm not that rich, or lucky. But yeah, I think what's quite interesting about the way that Doodles has done it, again, it's a Web3 first brand. They are looking to build it into a brand. And you've kind of seen this a little bit with Yuga Labs, but not so much. But what they started with 10,000 of the original ones, I think. But the idea that created the viral hype and the sort of want for that thing, and then the next series, Doodles 2, will probably be unlimited by the sounds of it, or at least it's going to be like in the millions, not in the thousands. So using that kind of way of getting a very small cohort, very excited and very engaged, and then using that to then actually create a mass market product is actually quite new. Like I said, Yuga Labs has done it a little bit, but actually really all they did was kind of like double the supply of each NFT as the series went on. So it wasn't quite the same as like going for actually a mass adoption route. So that it's interesting for that reason, but it's also very interesting because of the kind of interchangeable traits. So again, if you have a PFP, it's all based on the traits that you got as to the rarity and like how desirable that thing is. But with this, there's an element of like user input, which seems way more Web3 to me as well, which is kind of crazy. But I think that the way that they're doing it as well, they have like various like the duplicator and boxes and things like that, which as far as I can sort of tell is going to involve a lot more kind of interaction within people in the community. So if you have like a duplicator with like rare traits, yes, like I do, you can then like essentially sell those traits to other people.
Oh, fantastic.
So like there's that kind of element of like making it a bit more, making the community actually like interact with each other a bit more. Because I think if you only have like 10,000, it's a very different dynamic to if you have 1 million people, right? Yeah. So if you've got 10,000 people, probably all of those are owned by like 300 people, 3,000 people, sorry, not 300 people. You know, so actually it's a smaller community than it even sounds like it is. But then once you get to that kind of next level and you're trying to make something into like a real mass market product, you know, they've got Pharrell on board as their creative director as well, which is obviously very helpful. Releasing an album, things like that. But the way that people, the way that people interact with that brand is going to be different depending on how many people are interacting with it, right? Which is kind of like a weird but very obvious thing to say, but also quite like counterintuitive as to how you build that brand. So it's kind of like going from like a small startup into like a global brand effectively. So there's like way more pitfalls that they feel they've got to think about than worry about. But at the same time, it's quite exciting because it's probably the first one. I mean, other than maybe like Reddit, but they didn't even call it an NFT. So that was quite smart on their part. But yeah, in terms of like creating going from a small PFP sort of based project into like a mass market project is a very interesting transition that we haven't really seen yet. So yeah, I'm quite excited to just see how it all pans out, and like I'll probably end up buying a deal eventually, but I need a bit more money first.
It would be interesting to watch that journey, like you say, if it's the first in the space, how that kind of nets out. And you know, it's been a successful first round, so you know, we wish them all the best for the second round as well. I guess that's a really exciting way that what Web3 can maybe bring to Web2 brands, or you know, even startups, in that they, 10,000 is not a small number when you're selling them for however many ETH they are. So they have got a large amount of funding backed off the back of kind of like an early Apple's idea, really, that just, you know, because of the communication, engagement, clearly market fit, they've managed to get a fair bit of money behind them, and then now deliver on, like you say, a mass product. Where if you look at the more traditional Web2 models or things like that, you know, Facebook, now Meta, how they evolved, it was about mass adoption, free, and then we're going to start selling your data behind your back kind of thing. And this is like pretty upfront. This is the cost, but then you get all these benefits of being part of the community. Let's grow together, you know, rather than it's a bit more of a kind of transparent way around, I think, which is nice to see. And I think that's the way we're moving forward within the.
Yeah, and again, it's like you're treating them like a community as well, right? They're not just somebody that you just like talk at about how you feel about yourself. It's like a very selfish way to be. Imagine if somebody just came into a pub and they were just like, "Oh, right, so yeah, I'm going to talk to you about this, about myself, and you're going to think this about me." Basically, it's kind of what Web2 brands do, which is quite weird.
Yeah, I mean, what is the Apple Summit or whatever it is every year? You know, we get excited about the products because they usually end up in our pockets or in front of our laps, but you know, it's quite preachy, right? Rather than you know, like, what do you guys want? How do we want to do it? You know, it's a bit more of a,
I think it's quite again sort of slightly tangential, but like fashion brands have done way better at it because they're way more used to people like adopting their brand and making it their own. And I think that, for example, Porsche probably a lot less so than a fashion brand, but like probably more so than some other brands can do. But you know, people will, you know, wear different items of clothing differently, right? So they're already kind of customizing that thing and making it their own in their own mind.
The same outfit.
Yeah. So, but then it's to be able to have that feedback loop with your customers. Like, if you think how much money is spent on market research every year, it's just like, well, how about you turn that from a cost center into like something that's going to drive engagement with your users, so it actually becomes like part of your marketing.
Exactly, and that's a really powerful kind of message, right? That if you adopt this into your marketing strategy, rather than it being kind of a loss maker, you can make it into a net positive, right? And then fund that back into the community, and then building actually deeper engagement within within your business. But that's probably a whole other podcast within itself.
Yeah, I was about to go down the rabbit hole of the Starbucks loyalty scheme, but I won't.
we can do it to be continued, but just to kind of wrap this up and keep up with the housekeeping, we do have a wonderful blog coming out which is talking a little bit about this and gives this maybe, you know, some tips on how to set up an NFT project successfully, but equally, you know, if you want to get in contact with anyone and chat more NFTs, we're always open to the conversation. Guys, did you have any kind of passing thoughts before we close it off for today?
Other than, like, if you work at a big brand and you want to start an NFT project, come and talk to Eidgensi.
Love that. Look at that. Sure, doing the sell for Eidgensi. Well, Morgs, thank you so much for joining. It sounds like we've got another podcast in the pipes. And Chor, thanks for not going too deep down the rabbit hole. I know we could do that all day.
Yeah, I'll save it for the pub later.
Okay, so this has been LabTalks Takeover by Eidgensi. Thank you.
Thank you.